Story 1. The Disappearing Roadside Diner. I'd been driving for hours through the night, the endless stretch of highway hypnotizing me into a trance. My eyelids were heavy, and my body ached for rest, but I was determined to reach my destination before dawn. Just as I thought I couldn't go on any longer, I saw it. A quaint little diner, its neon sign flickering in the darkness like a beacon of hope. Pulling into the gravel lot, I parked my car and looked around. The place seemed deserted, yet inviting. The sign read, Molly's Diner, and it promised hot food and coffee. Eager for a break, I stepped out of the car, the cool night air reviving my senses. The diner was charming, in an old-fashioned way, with checkered curtains and a warm yellow glow from the inside. Pushing the door open, the sound of a bell announcing my arrival, I was greeted by the aroma of coffee and the sight of empty booths lined against the windows. "Hello?" I called out, but there was no response, so I figured the staff might be in the back, so I took a seat at the counter, my stomach rumbling in anticipation of a hearty meal. Minutes passed, but no one came. The silence was unsettling, and a sense of unease crept over me. I considered leaving, but the thought of hot coffee and food was too tempting. I decided to wait a little longer, hoping someone would show up. As I sat there, I noticed something odd. The diner, though seemingly well kept, had an air of abandonment. Dust collected on the shelves, and the coffee pot on the counter looked like it hadn't been used in ages. I felt a chill run down my spine. Suddenly, a gust of wind blew through the diner, rattling the windows and making me jump. I looked around, half expecting to see someone, but I was still alone. That's when I heard it. A faint whisper, like someone calling my name from far away. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. "Hello? Is anyone here?" My voice echoed through the empty diner. There was no reply, only the sound of the wind outside. I decided it was time to leave. This place was giving me the creeps. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. As I turned towards the door, I caught a glimpse of something in the mirror behind the counter. A shadowy figure, standing in the corner of the diner. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. My mind was playing tricks on me, I thought. I needed to get out of there. I hurried to the door, my hands shaking as I pushed it open. Stepping outside, I was met with a sight that stopped me in my tracks. The diner, the gravel lot, even my car, everything was gone. I was standing in the middle of an empty field, the highway nowhere in sight. Panic set in as I tried to make sense of it all. I spun around looking for any sign of the diner, but there was nothing. The night was silent, the only sound being my own ragged breathing. I was lost, alone, and confused. Desperate, I started walking, hoping to find the highway or any sign of civilization. Hours passed, and the first light of dawn began to break through the darkness. My legs were heavy and my throat was parched. Finally, I saw it. The highway. Cars zooming past me. Relief washed over me as I stumbled towards it, waving my arms, trying to catch the attention of a passing driver. A trucker eventually pulled over, concern etched on his face. I explained what had happened, but my story sounded crazy even to my own ears. The trucker gave me a skeptical look but offered me a ride to the nearest town. As we drove, I looked back, half expecting to see Molly's diner reappear in the rearview mirror. But there was nothing, only the open road stretching behind us. I never found out what happened that night. I never saw that diner again, but the memory of it haunts me to this day. Sometimes, when I'm driving late at night, I see the flickering neon sign of Molly's diner in the distance. But when I blink, it's gone. Story 2. The Lost Town. I've always been fascinated by uncharted places, the kind that don't appear on any maps. So when I heard rumors of a lost town somewhere in the backwoods of West Virginia, my curiosity was piqued. According to legend, this town vanished overnight, leaving behind only stories and an eerie feeling of abandonment. I decided to investigate, thinking it would be a great subject for my blog on urban legends. I packed my gear and set off on a chilly October morning. The drive was long and uneventful until I turned onto a narrow, winding road that disappeared into the dense forest. The further I drove, the more I felt I was entering another world. The trees seemed to close in around me, and a heavy fog hung in the air. After a few hours, my GPS lost signal, and I was driving blind, but I didn't turn back. The thrill of the unknown was too strong. Just as the sun began to set, I saw it. The town. It was exactly as the story is described, a small collection of buildings frozen in time. I parked my car at the edge of the town and grabbed my camera. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own footsteps on the gravel road. The buildings looked like they belonged in a different era, with peeling paint and boarded-up windows. It was as if the residents had simply vanished, leaving everything behind. I walked down the main street, my camera clicking away. The feeling of being watched crept over me, but I shrugged it off as nerves. I peered into windows, trying to catch a glimpse of the past. In one window, I saw a half-finished meal on a table covered in dust. As the light faded, a chill ran down my spine. I should have turned back then, but my curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to see more, to uncover the secrets of this ghostly town. I found an old diner at the end of the street. The door was ajar, so I pushed it open and stepped inside. The air was stale, and a thick layer of dust covered everything. The counter was lined with stools, and a jukebox sat in the corner, silent and forgotten. I explored the diner, taking pictures and notes. And that's when I heard it, a faint whisper, like someone calling out from a distance. I froze, listening intently. The whisper turned into a low murmur, and then silence. Feeling unnerved, I decided it was time to leave. But as I turned towards the door, I saw a figure standing in the shadows. I blinked, and it was gone. My heart raced, and I rushed outside, the sound of my own breathing loud in my ears. Back on the street, I noticed something strange. The fog had grown thicker, and the town seemed different in some way. Buildings that I hadn't seen before loomed out of the mist, and the ones I'd photographed were nowhere to be seen. I realized I was lost, and panic set in. The familiar landmarks were gone, replaced by an ever-changing maze of streets and buildings. I wandered aimlessly, calling out for help, but there was no response, only the echo of my own voice. Hours passed, and exhaustion took over. I collapsed on the steps of a building, my mind racing with fear. and that's when I saw them. Figures moving in the fog, just out of sight. They whispered and laughed, their voices sending shivers down my spine. I got up and ran, not knowing where I was going, only that I needed to escape. The figures followed, always just a step behind. I could feel their breath on my neck, their fingers grazing my back. Just when I thought I couldn't go on, I saw a light in the distance. It was my car, parked where I'd left it. I didn't stop to question how I'd found it. I just got in and drove, not looking back. As I drove, the fog lifted and the town disappeared behind me. When I finally stopped at a gas station, I checked my camera, and all the photos I'd taken were gone, replaced by static and blurred images. I never returned to that lost town, and I never wrote about it in my blog. Some stories are better left untold. Some places better left unexplored. But the memory of that night still haunts me. Story 3. The Creepy Gas Station. It was late one night, and I was driving across the state to visit my family. The roads were mostly empty, and the darkness seemed to stretch on forever. My eyes were getting heavy, and the hum of the engine was lulling me into a drowsy state. I knew I needed to stop and stretch my legs, maybe grab a cup of coffee to keep me awake. That's when I saw an old gas station, its flickering neon sign promising fuel and a convenience store. Pulling into the deserted lot, I noticed how run down the place looked. It was the kind of place you'd normally avoid, but at that moment, I was grateful for any sign of civilization. I parked in the front of the store and got out, stretching my stiff limbs. The night air was cool and had a faintly odd smell that I couldn't quite place. I shrugged it off and walked towards the entrance. As I entered the store, a bell chimed above the door, its sound echoing in the empty space. The interior was dimly lit, with rows of dusty shelves and a counter at the far end. I couldn't see anyone around, so I called out a greeting. "Hello? Anyone here?" There was no response. I walked further into the store, looking for the coffee machine. The place was eerily silent, save for the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights. I found the coffee, but it looked old and stale. Disappointed, I decided to just grab a snack and pay at the counter. That's when I heard a noise coming from the back of the store, like someone shuffling around. I turned and saw the attendant emerge from the back room. He was an older man, with a gaunt face and sunken eyes. He wore a dirty, faded uniform, and his gaze seemed distant and unfocused. "Good evening," I said, trying to sound friendly. But the attendant just stared at me, not saying a word. It was unnerving, but I figured he was just tired or maybe not used to seeing customers at this hour. I placed my snacks on the counter and took out my wallet. The man's gaze followed my every move, but he remained silent. "Can I pay for these and get some gas, please?" I asked, feeling more uncomfortable by the second. Finally, the attendant spoke, his voice low and raspy. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his eyes locked on mine. I was taken aback. "Excuse me?" "Bad things happen to those who stop here," he continued, his expression blank. I didn't know how to respond. Was this some kind of joke? I laughed nervously, trying to lighten the mood. "Well, I just need some gas, and I'll be on my way." The attendant didn't laugh. He just stared at me, then slowly reached for the snacks and began ringing them up. I paid, eager to leave this unsettling place. As I turned to exit, the attendant spoke again. "Beware, the road ahead," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't reply. I just hurried out of the store and back to my car. I filled up the tank, my eyes darting around the empty lot. The attendant's words echoed in my head, making me feel uneasy. I got back to the road, trying to shake off the creepy encounter, but as I drove, the night seemed darker, the road more isolated. I couldn't stop thinking about what the attendant had said. After a few miles, I noticed something odd. The road seemed to be changing. Familiar landmarks were missing, and the terrain looked different. A dense fog began to roll in, obscuring my view. Panic set in as I realized I was lost. The GPS was no help, its screen flickering and then going blank. I slowed down, trying to make sense of my surroundings, but nothing looked familiar. And that's when I saw them. Figures standing by the side of the road, just outside the reach of my headlights. They were motionless, their faces hidden in the shadows. I gripped the steering wheel, my heart pounding. I didn't dare to stop or slow down. As I drove past, I could feel their eyes on me, watching me pass. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly, the fog growing thicker. I was disoriented, unsure of which way to turn. And every so often I'd see more figures by the roadside standing silently in the night. Hours passed and my fuel gauge was getting low. I was on the verge of panic when I finally saw lights up ahead. It was a small town, a beacon of hope in the darkness. I pulled into the town and parked, relief washing over me. I got out of the car, my legs shaky. The town was quiet, but it felt safe, normal. I found a motel and checked in for the night, too exhausted to go any further. The next morning I asked the motel owner about the gas station and the road I'd traveled. He looked at me, puzzled. There was no gas station like the one I described for miles, he said, and the road I'd mentioned didn't exist. I left the town feeling confused and uneasy. I couldn't explain what happened that night, and a part of me didn't want to. I just wanted to forget the creepy gas station and the warning of the attendant. But sometimes, late at night, I remember his words, and I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed at the gas station any longer. I think about the figures by the road and the fog that swallowed me whole. It's a mystery I'll never solve, a memory that haunts me to this day. And one thing I know for sure, I'll never stop at a deserted gas station in the middle of the night ever again.